first.
I have a time problem, so my instructions were to summarize in 3 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes, we're trying to
Okay.
move things along, and I apologize to the witnesses.
That's all right. With your permission, then, I will just submit my entire statement for the record with the attachments, and I will summarize it very briefly. Just following up on a couple things that the previous witness said, I think I can shed light on a few questions. For example, you asked him, and he commented about the negotiating down of the fines and the problems that were found. When I was Inspector General, we actually investigated that. We looked at what was the result of the fines and that were proposed for very serious violations, and what happened to them. Why was no one ever held accountable? And the problem is that it turned out to be about 10 cents on the dollar. You would see a lot of big fines proposed, a lot of saber rattling, a lot of tough talk, but months or years down the pike, when all the attention of the hour went away, the real result was about 10 cents on the dollar. And I did put in my testimony over the last 3 years preceding the 9/11 attacks, both the carriers, American and United, did have record numbers of fines, one at 3.4 million, one at 3.6, but when you consider that's about 10 cents on the dollar, that would recognize a really staggering number of violations, and as the previous witness said, in some cases it became paying as opposed to improving because it was easier to pay the fines and go on without a big investment. Another thing that is very, very important to note, and I must take a little bit of issue with some of the previous testimony, and because it's a very common public misconception, is that the responsibility and the obligation for security is now passed from the airlines to the TSA. Nothing could be further from the truth. I have put in my testimony what the current law is. The current law is very similar to the previous law in that both airlines and airports do still share security responsibility, and I agree with the previous witness that it is absolutely imperative. You cannot possibly lift that from the airlines or airports, because then you have lost a very important component of your triad for safety and security in this country. But it is still the law that they are responsible for it, and that's why the Actions Committee is so very important, because what we have seen time and time before is that there really isn't any accountability. You have these tragedies, and I've put in my testimony some, hopefully some rather sobering numbers. We hear a lot of testimony, a lot of public urban legend about nothing like this has ever happened before. It hasn't happened in the United States. Planes have never been used as weapons of terror or of destruction. And in many cases, I had to resort, and I want to point this out because it's very important, in many cases to do our original research, we had to resort to media reports. Because, among other things, lots of obscure government regulations sometimes inhibit good institutional memory. For example, the sundown rules on government records. We very routinely, and I was a government employee myself for I suppose if you add all the service together, almost 2 decades. But the problem is you toss out your records, you send them off to Boyers, Pennsylvania, you shred them up in the shredder legally, I might add, after 3 years, and there goes your institutional memory. Parties change, people move on, people retire, and everyone ceases to remember what has really happened. And if with your permission, I'll stand up here for a second, because I think I can shed some light on some of these now erroneous misconceptions about security. First of all, about the warnings, and I put this in my testimony. Everybody said, well, nobody knew about any direct threats. We then had Condoleezza Rice talk about 15 there's an argument over defined specific, but they're pretty specific warnings. And in fact, we had in the Federal Register on July 17, 2001, some rather alarming language. And by the way, the carriers were alerted to this because they responded to this notice of proposed rulemaking, complaining about the expense that the security would cost them. So they were very clearly put on notice because they complained. And in particular, this Federal Register, published for all to see, clearly still out there for us lawyers to go get, said the terrorist threat level in the United States over the next decade will remain at least as high as it is and will probably rise. Expanding geographical range of terrorist activity is increasingly evident, and members of foreign terrorist groups, representatives from state sponsors of terrorism, and radical fundamental element are present in the United States. This particular Federal Register goes on at length Indeed, there were additional pages talking about the threat, and in particular, it pointed out the threat events in Asia in 1995, in which attacks on 12 jetliners and attacks on buildings was anticipated. And finally, it goes on to mention that civil aviation, and I quote, civil aviation targets may be chosen by terrorists, even if alternative and softer targets are available, especially since attack on aviation seizes the public imagination to a degree unequaled by other types of attacks. And so I find it interesting that a lot of sort of after the fact facts are being created, but there it was in the federal record. Another thing that's important to point out is what the threat really is. And I think the mistake that we have made so many times in the past is, as a nation, we continue to respond to the last attack. So we were busy talking about bombs and suitcases when there were many other things going on. And so I put in there, and again, for a lot of these, because the institutional memory is gone, we had to resort to public accounts of things that have happened. And we had many things happen in 1970, 2001. Hijackings, cockpit intrusions were, contrary to what people say, common. Bombing, shoot down, and air rage incidents. In the short months just preceding 9/11, we had 30 cockpit intrusions. The thought that you can't get into the cockpit is belied by the facts. There they were, 18 months. Now, we're all talking about bombs on jetliners, bombing the plane, something we were all busy as a nation and as a government focused on 9/11. Indeed, I was able to find 31 from 1970 to 2001. But there were many other things going on. In particular, there was lots of air raging, things going on in airplanes. I used United Zone numbers for that. 531, 621, 454. They didn't have any data for 2001. The FAA's didn't match even United's, which was interesting. The FAA's ranged from 320 to 266. There was a whole lot going on those airplanes, including cockpit intrusions, that our data wasn't collecting. In particular, the air rage incidents often turned ugly and violent. Indeed, passengers and others were harmed or died before 9/11. When I resorted to looking not on our official government reports, but looking to the First Amendment for some real data, I got an astounding 47,402 from 1994 to 2001. And the most astonishing figure of all to me, and a real alarm, and I know that's not exactly what the hearings are about, but the whole idea is to protect Americans, was this number. When I resorted to looking at reports other than official government reports to find instances where planes were shot at or shot down, in particular 2 weeks ago or a few weeks ago, we heard about the instance against the Israel plane, and people were saying, well, that hasn't been done before. It has. 59 times I found when I resorted to data other than just government data where that's occurred. And finally, the biggest shock when I did research across the board is I came up with 823 airlines hijacked from 70 to 2001. 115 of those hijackings, the passengers or the crew were able to overcome them, were able to fight back. Look at that savings there. They were able to save their lives, save the plane, save the carrier in those instances. And so in this country, we had all these these warnings, these things that went out, but no one was allowed to know. Even now, after the fact, they're saying, well, these are all secret. You can't know them. Something could have been done, even with information. Information may have indeed been the most powerful weapon we had, and not only was it not told to the persons who might have actually been able to do something about it. Now, in retrospect, it's all a big secret. Finally, we had 109 airlines on U.S. soil, 58 on foreign soil, surprisingly 11 foreign on U.S. soil. And probably the biggest and most alarming urban legend that has come out, and I have a difficult time figuring or excusing that it was accidental, is the after the fact statements that no rules were broken on 9/11. What could you have done? Nothing was wrong. Nobody violated any laws. Nobody violated any federal regulations. That is absolutely false. In my statement, I go over the various federal regulations that required security on the various carriers and obligations on them. And then, of course, we all heard, including persons you have heard from, who went on the media to say box cutters were allowed. They were not. Most assuredly not allowed. This comes from the regulations and the guidelines that the carriers use to do their security. And by the way, since,
We're exceeding the 3 minutes a bit.
okay, and neither was pepper spray.